Okay. Thank you all for the interest in our beloved dad's story. My dad is 96. He is alive. Unfortunately, he can't be with us here today. But my mom is here. My mom and my dad have been together almost 74 years and married almost 69. My brother David came down from Baltimore, my sister. And so my dad's story is both a heartbreaking and a heartwarming story. It's a heartbreaking story because he suffered the worst of what the Holocaust had to offer, really the worst, and you'll see why. I'd say that in a few minutes. And it's also a heartwarming story because he survived, and then he was helped a lot, and it all helped him to become the amazing person that he is, professionally and personally and religiously. So let me begin. First of all, does everybody know me? Do you know that I'm... Okay, great. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder that myself. So at first I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what my father went through in the Holocaust, just so you have a sense of just how much he suffered. And these are actually his slides. He used to go and talk to groups like high schools and colleges and synagogues, so I'm going to use his slides for a little bit. And then I'll tell you about his life. He went to England after the war and he rebuilt his life, and then I'll talk a little bit about his life after that. Okay. So my dad was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1927. He was the youngest of 4 children. Can you see that picture?
It's better if you shut those lights too.
So my dad was the youngest of 4 children. He's the little one in the middle. He was very cute, still is. And his oldest brother is not in the picture. His oldest brother had left for Paris. He was 14 years older than my father, but he went to Paris before the war because it was so anti-Semitic in Warsaw that he felt he couldn't go to college there. So my dad went to a Jewish day school, and my grandparents had a reasonably successful factory and business selling or making and selling hats and coats. That pointer shows where my dad is. Anyway, so September 1st was the first day of the war in Warsaw, and unfortunately that day there was a big bomb that fell on the building where my dad lived, and there was a big crack in the walls, and they never were able to fix that. And pretty soon, food rationing happened, and if a Jew was caught in a food line, they were kicked out if someone figured out they were Jewish. And people were living outside. It got very hot, got very cold, and it was getting very, very hard for people. And then pretty soon, the Nazis erected the Warsaw ghetto walls. So what they did is they took all the Jews from Warsaw and put them into the ghetto area. They also brought Jews from outside of Warsaw and put them in the ghetto. My dad happened to be living in the part that became the ghetto. So people came and lived in their apartments. Strangers, perfect strangers, were put in the apartments with them. And some people didn't even find a place to live, so they had to live on the street. So walking down the streets of Warsaw, this is the kind of scene my dad saw. He saw people starving to death, and he saw people who died and had to be taken away. This was on a daily basis. And eventually in 1940, so just a few months after the war began, there was actually no trade. You could not go to a store to buy anything. So the only way you could get food or other necessities was to smuggle out to the outside of the Warsaw Ghetto. And my dad did that quite a bit. Apparently, he was a good candidate for smuggling because he was still a small boy, and he had blonde hair, blue eyes, didn't look very Jewish, and he found ways to sneak out, and he was able to bring in some food. The other thing was that the schooling for the Jews was canceled. The school was just not able to operate. So my grandparents and some other parents got together and hired a tutor, and they were teaching the children for a while. Unfortunately, one day the Nazis came in, took the tutor away. He was never seen again. And that was the end of the schooling efforts for my dad. He was about 12 years old at the time. And so anyway, here's a scene of children climbing the wall to try and get food. it was a very, very desperate situation in the Warsaw Ghetto. So by 1941, my dad was showing a lot of medical problems. I'll just tell you a little aside story. My dad was so sick that they went to the rabbi and they said, "What can we do?" And the rabbi said, "Let's give him a new name." So the new name given to my dad is Alta. So he's Alta Meir. Alta means old one. So when he turned 90, we said, "Dad, I think the name worked." Continuing to work. But anyway, at this point, 1941, my grandparents thought the only way to get, my dad was not going to survive if he stayed in the ghetto. So the only way to possibly save his life was to get him out of there. So I mentioned that my grandparents had a business, and they therefore had a lot of non-Jewish clients, and a lot of them were friends. They were friends of my grandparents. So one of them had a son who was the policeman on the trolley. There was like a trolley or streetcar that operated outside of the ghetto. It didn't come in and take people inside the ghetto, but it had to turn around inside the ghetto because before they erected the walls of the ghetto, that was where the train tracks were. So the policeman actually came to my grandparents' home, and he met with my dad and a cousin that my dad escaped with. And the policeman told them exactly how to get onto the trolley, how to hop on when the train was turning around inside the ghetto. They had to hide underneath the seat so that when the Nazis peeked through the window as they went through the walls, they weren't detected. And then they had to pop up once they were outside the ghetto, pop up at just the right moment so that it looked like they had just come on to the train and hadn't snuck on in the ghetto. Fortunately, they did make it, and my dad was 13 years old when he left home. He never saw his parents again. He did escape with a cousin who was a little bit older. So after they made it through the streetcar, which is itself very risky, my dad was so fearful. You can imagine being 13 years old, and I mean, that's a very dramatic escape. Then he still had to walk through the outside of Warsaw, outside the ghetto, and if anyone figured out that they were Jewish, that was grounds to be shot. And then they wanted to take a boat. They were going to go about 120 miles south of Warsaw, so they took a boat ride down the river and get off near their destination. And my dad said he was so afraid on the boat because there were a lot of Polish peasants and farmers, and they were very anti-Semitic. So never mind even the Nazis. If any of the Poles figured out that they were Jewish, that was another reason to possibly shoot them. Thank God they were not detected. They made it to their destination. They got off and they walked to my father's cousin's home, which was several hours of walking, but the cousin somehow knew how to do that. My dad rested for a couple of days, and then he went by horse and buggy. And let me show you where he went to. So this is kind of a map. If you can see, this is Warsaw. Can you all see this? Warsaw, and this is his destination was a town called Ostrowiec. There's a river here that he took the boat on, but he was coming to Ostrowiec. And the reason he went to Ostrowiec is he had 3 sets of relatives there. He lived with one of his aunts. She had 5 children, and the oldest 2 children ended up being in the war with my dad pretty much the whole way. Unfortunately, one of them got killed just a month before the end of the war, but mainly they were together. The 3 of them were together, and that was very helpful for all of them. They really helped each other. So my dad started out in Ostrowiec. It was a lot better than in Warsaw. Initially, there was food and there wasn't a ghetto, but pretty soon things declined very quickly. There was less food, and they erected a ghetto there. But my father, he said he volunteered, which meant he worked without pay. He volunteered in an ironworks factory. There was a huge factory there, and he worked as a slave. And then his two oldest cousins came and also worked in the factory. So even though the conditions were horrible, it actually saved their life because in 1942, October 1942, the Nazis rounded up all the Jews and took them to be exterminated. But the Jews who worked in the factory, this ironworks factory, as well as there was a smaller factory in town that made bricks, they were saved because they were considered essential workers. So they, after the liquidation of the ghetto, they started to live right by the factory. They erected barracks for them. They lived in the factory and they worked there. They might have an 8-hour shift and then another 8-hour shift and maybe even another 8-hour shift, but they got some basic level of food. And this arrangement, even though it wasn't great, it lasted for about 2.5 years and really helped them to stay alive. But he worked there from 1941 at some point till the summer of 1943. 1944. Here's a picture of the ironworks factory. I'm not sure what date this photo is from, but this was a huge factory. It employed a lot of people, or used a lot of slaves, I should say. So then, in August 1944, they put all the workers from the factory on a transport. My dad started out at Austerlitz, and he ended up in Auschwitz. It's about 120 miles. And so actually, they didn't know where they were going to go. They were put on trains. They didn't tell them where they were going. My dad said it was squished in. You were standing like sardines. There was no room to move. There was no food. There were no sanitation facilities. And they didn't know where they were going. There's an exhibit going around the country. I don't know if any of you have seen it, where they bring a train car like the Jews were transported in, and you get to go in and just feel so claustrophobic. So I can't imagine how they felt on that train. But anyway, they got to their destination, and it was Auschwitz. And my dad talked about how there was like complete pandemonium and noise, and people were yelling and schnell, schnell, hurry, hurry, and there was dogs barking, and there was shooting, and they were like whacking people with their batons. It was really like a very unpleasant welcome there. Now, you've probably heard about selections where they had people, like the workers go in, the healthy-looking people go in one direction, and the old people, the young people, the sick-looking people, and the women going in another direction. My father said that he did not experience that because his entire transport was these strong slaves from the factory that he worked in. And they were pretty much teenagers or young adults, and they were strong because they'd been lifting iron. So they were strong. So he did not have that particular problem, but others did. So he went to the showers that were actually water. And the Nazis, as you probably know, were great at telling lies. So the one lie was, take off your clothes, label them, and you'll get the clothes back after the shower. Of course, they never got them back. They got these pajama kind of clothes. And my dad said that, if you were cold, like the winters there are so cold, so sometimes people would take the paper from the outside of a cement bag or something, and they'd put it underneath those pajama-like outfits. And if they were discovered to have that, that was another grounds for being shot. So needless to say, they never got their clothes back. They had to wear that in Auschwitz. Another lie was work makes free. You may have seen this sign up at Auschwitz. Work did not make them free, but that was the lie told. So some of the indignities that my dad, and deprivations that my dad suffered included, pretty soon after arrival, he had a tattoo. His number was B5247, and his two cousins were the two numbers before him. The food, there was hardly any food, and what there was not very nutritious. These were the sleeping arrangements: no sheets, no blankets, no pillows. You didn't even get your own bunk. Very unpleasant. You couldn't go to the bathroom when you felt like it. Someone would say, right, time to go, and it was often at 2 in the morning, so they had to run to something that looked like that. There were no towels, no toothpaste, no soap, so you can imagine the lack of hygiene that they experienced. And then another indignity was they were called every day to the appell plots where they had to stand and be counted. And the Nazis didn't care if it was raining or it was snowing or if it was cold or sunny or whatever. They just had to stand out there as many hours as the Nazis wanted them to, and they were counted. So my father and his cousins had figured out a strategy for survival, and one of these strategies was that they did whatever work the Nazis needed to have done. So one day a Nazi came to the barracks where they were sleeping, or where they slept, and he said, "We need Zimmerman." And my father and his two cousins said, "Yeah, we're Zimmerman." They had no idea what a Zimmerman was, but they knew that if the Nazis needed a Zimmerman, they were going to be Zimmerman. Well, it turned out a Zimmerman is like a carpenter or contractor kind of person. So that's what they did. They were building buildings and fixing buildings. My dad described to me once, he said he's wearing the pajama type of things, and it was very, very cold outside, and he's very high up. He has no gloves, and he's hammering nails, and it was icy, and he looked down. It was so far down, he thought, oh my goodness, what happens if I make one slip? That will be the end of me. So those are the kind of conditions he was working in. Needless to say, they worked many hours and very hard work. He described that every day they had to walk from Auschwitz, where they lived, where they slept, to Buna. Buna was a big subcamp of Auschwitz, and the Nazis had Jewish musicians at the gate. So as my dad and the other workers walked out or walked in, they were accompanied to music. I don't know what that did for anybody, but it's kind of a cruelty. And the Nazis were obsessed with counting them, so they counted them as they went out and as they came back. My dad worked for IG Farben, which was a great big German company. They made artificial rubber. After the war, he got a little bit of a compensation for having been a slave. Not nearly enough to compensate him, but at least he got a little bit of something. So he described life in Auschwitz as like prison life, only much worse. Every minute, every hour, every day, he never knew, was he going to survive? Because any day he could starve to death or get sick or someone could shoot him or whatever else might happen. It was really horrible there, and he witnessed many, many horrible things, including being beaten at work. And that kind of lasted, so from August when he arrived until the middle of January. So in the middle of January, the Russians were coming from the east. And the Nazis, instead of leaving the Jews there to be liberated in January, they decided to put them on a death march. So this is the first of 2 death marches that my dad would be in. They took the Jews out of Auschwitz. They gave them 1 loaf of bread, no water. My dad said if you didn't have shoes, you couldn't survive. Now the shoes weren't the kind that we get fitted and make sure they fit right. We get orthotics and all that. These were shoes you maybe took off someone who died, or they didn't necessarily fit you, but if you had shoes, you had a chance of surviving. Without shoes, you just couldn't survive. And the Nazis forced people to walk in groups of 10 by 10, 10 width, 10 depth. And if you got out of that formation and you sat down to rest or to tie your shoe or whatever, they could shoot you. And they were shooting people all through the night. Apparently they left, I think, in the afternoon and walked all through the night. It was really cold, and they're wearing these pajama kind of things. In the morning, they finally stopped at a brick factory and I think got a little bit of a rest. And then they were put on a train. This time, it was an open train, meaning no roof, which in a way was good, I guess, because they got sunshine and fresh air, but it was also the middle of a Polish winter, and snow and ice and anything else cold could come in. So again, they were inhumane conditions. But this is their trip. They went from Auschwitz to Buchenwald, which is in Germany. It's about a 400-mile trip, about like from Boston to Washington. So it wasn't a short trip, but the trains were slower than they are here. So that was a very difficult trip. And it's even a worse place than Auschwitz. This was about the end of January 1945. The war was going to be over in about 3 or 4 months. And the Nazi war effort was falling apart. So they weren't very organized. They didn't have a lot of good work for them to do. So sometimes they made work, like they'd say, carry these boulders up the hill and then carry them back down again. Just evil, just to be cruel. And they didn't have much food. They had even less food than in Auschwitz, if that could be believed. And absolutely no hygiene facilities. My dad talked about how, or actually my dad's cousin talked about how their faces were all dirty because they literally couldn't wash for months at a time. So then in April, sometime in April, again, the Allies were coming from the West. So the Americans, the British, and the French were coming from the West, the Russians from the East. And the Nazis didn't want to show the world what they'd been doing to their Jews. So they put them in trains again. And this is the second death march my dad was on, this time on a train, though. So he was going from Buchenwald to Theresienstadt, which is about 120 miles. But instead of going from point A to point B, they tried to evade being caught. So they went this way and that way and the other way and the other way and went backwards. And they just kept going for about 3.5 weeks. There was no food, there was no water, there were no hygiene facilities, and they're on this train. So my dad said it was very disorganized. And so when the train stopped, the first thing they had to do, the people who were alive had to throw the dead people out of the train. And only about 10% of the people on this death march survived. So that was a really awful situation. My dad said that all he could find for food usually was grass and leaves. So that was what they ate. One time they found a potato one potato, and my dad's second cousin had already been killed, but so he was just with one cousin. The two young men had one potato that lasted them 4 days. The two of them ate little tiny bites just for, just every few hours to keep them going a little bit. So that was pretty awful. So this is actually one of the trains that my dad would have been transported in. This is a picture my dad has in his collection, because a lot of these children are ones that he went to England with. We know who they are. So he was liberated on May 8th, 1945 by the Russians, and he always celebrated that day. That was almost like a birthday to him. That was the day he was liberated. Unfortunately, after all that deprivation and those 3 weeks in the second death march, he was so sick. The one thing he really regretted was he couldn't get up and watch the Nazis run away. He just wasn't able to see them. But this picture was taken on Liberation Day, and you can see the boys are quite, they're celebrating. They were liberated. So my dad went to the hospital. He was very sick. He said that if the war had gone on for another week, he wouldn't have survived. But thank God it did stop, and he was put in the hospital. He was treated by Russian doctors and nurses. My dad said they thought he wouldn't make it, but he did make it, and they did nurse him back to some level of health. And then he found out about a group that was going to go to England. And so they started joining as a group already in Theresienstadt. So England said, we'll allow in 1,000 young survivors, but they have to be 15 or under, and they have to be healthy. So my dad was 18, and he wasn't very healthy. He was more healthy than when he came, but not that healthy. Thank God there was I think he was a Jewish doctor, a medical doctor, and he changed the certificates. We have the certificates for my dad. He said, okay, he's born in 1930, which makes my dad 15 years old instead of 18, and he said he's healthy. This man understood that it was better for these kids to get to England, to get out of this horrible situation in Czechoslovakia. So thank God my dad and many, many of the other boys were allowed to go to England because of that medical officer. So a lot of them actually arrived very sick in England, but at least they survived. So my dad was going to go to England, and he was one of a group called the Boys. I don't know if you can see this, but Martin Gilbert, who's a famous historian, wrote a book about them in the 1990s. It's called The Boys, and I don't know if you can see this. There's an iconic photo of them on here, which I'll show you a bigger version of in a minute. And so basically, they couldn't, did I mention that England said they'd allow in 1,000 young survivors? They only found 732 of them that met the right criteria within some sort of acceptable range. So the first 300 went to Windermere. It's in the very north of England. There's a lake there. It's in the Lake District. It's very beautiful. There are mountains and lakes. And they found a place that they could accommodate 300 children. So the first 300 are the Windermere children, but the bigger group is called the Boys. And they left England on August 14th, 1945. So this is the picture I was trying to show you on the front of this book. But what I wanted to show you is it's the same picture again. Can you all see this? Can you see it, or a little bit? Can someone turn on the light just for a second? Okay, so Theresienstadt is very near Prague. So they went, in order to fly to England, they went to Prague, and they took group photos of these 300 children. So there are like 3 or 4 pictures like this of the group, and my dad is this one in the red circle here, and this is right before they're about to go to the airport to fly to England. So in 2019, 250 of us went to Prague, and we retook the photo. And so there were some of the original boys, and I should mention that there were some girls in this group. They liked to be called the Boys. They were actually happy to be called one of the boys. But there were about 82 girls, I think, out of 732. So anyway, here we tried to stand kind of near where my dad was. Can you see us there? I went with two of my sons and a daughter-in-law. And it was really quite, sort of felt like a triumph. Like they tried to kill us. My dad almost died. All these boys almost died. They survived. And here we are, 74 years later, triumphant. Okay, so we can turn off light. Thank you. So my dad pointed out that's him. He had a shaved head. I don't know if you could tell, but I guess because of the lice that they all had, they shaved their head. So my dad did not talk to us very much about the Holocaust when we were young, but there was one story that he loved to tell. And the story was the airplane flight from Prague to England. So they didn't fly in a commercial jet. He said they flew on these small planes that had been 3 months earlier during the war. They were bombers, so they would drop bombs on the enemy. And they had the windows all blued out, so you couldn't really look out the window. He said, we sat on the floor, no seats, and then with a twinkle in his eye, he would say, and the pilot gave us a chocolate bar. And so, when you fly, you don't know who the pilot is. Usually they disappear. You never even knew their name or their face. But there's a man who's been studying the Windermere children, and he found the pilot. So right before we went to Prague, this man in the picture here, that's the pilot. He was only 2 years older than my dad when he flew them to England. He was 20, my dad was 18. He had flown for the RAF, and the RAF said, fly to Prague, bring back some children to England. And he was the one that bought the chocolate bars. So he came to a reunion of the boys. Every year they have a big reunion in London with hundreds of people. And he brought more chocolate bars and handed them out. And the other nice thing was we were so grateful, my family, we wrote him a letter, an email. We thanked him for flying my dad and the other boys to England. And we thanked him because he thought sort of more high level, like these children 3 months before were almost starved to death. And not only did he give them food, which would have been wonderful, but he gave them something a cut above, a chocolate bar, which probably they hadn't had for years and years. And so we thanked him, and his granddaughter told us she read the letter to him. So anyway, that was a kind of a nice story. Okay, so last year I was able to go to Windermere. They invited us, second generation, to go and sort of walk in the footsteps of our parents. I was there, and Windermere is so beautiful. You can see a picture. There are like mountains and lakes, so that's a typical picture. On the right, the grassy area, that's where the homes were, the little buildings where the boys stayed, where they lived. They each had their own little building. The man talking to the group is Trevor Avery. He's the head of the Lake District Holocaust Project. He's the one that's really studying this group. And the people there, it's all our second generation. There were about 150 of us who went to Windermere to see where our parents were. Now my dad, even though he made it healthily enough to England, he was sick pretty soon after he got there. And one day he was playing soccer, and he fell down and he couldn't get up. So this is a picture taken in Windermere. It's in the sick bay. I don't know if you can see, the boys are all in bed. They're lying in a bed. They're each in a bed. My dad is the one circle there. And if you saw the movie or the documentary, they brought in a lot of people to Windermere to support the kids. So they brought in teachers, they brought in an art therapist and a rabbi and a soccer coach. And they brought in my mother's older sister, Elizabeth. She lived in England. She wasn't a Holocaust survivor like this, but she came and worked with the young people. In fact, she brought the very religious boys to Gateshead, which is a frum community in England. She worked with them at Windermere and then later in Gateshead. But anyway, so this lady is Marie Paneth. If you saw the movie, she was the art therapist, but she was also a teacher. And the words on the blackboard are English, but I can't figure out what she was trying to teach them. But already in the first month, they're learning things. Imagine they don't know English. All of them hadn't had any education for several years because they were in the war. But then my dad was pretty sick, and the treatment for tuberculosis, it turned out he had tuberculosis. So the treatment at that time was complete bed rest and fresh air. So they took my dad by ambulance to this place. It was called Meathop Grange. It was a building, like a set of buildings way out in the country. There was nothing around it except for like farms, and nearby was the ocean. So the air smelled so sweet and a little bit salty because it had the sea air and the fresh country air. So he was taken there. I went, Trevor is the guy on the left there. He wanted me to see where my dad was taken when he was so sick. So we went there to see. So that was nice to see where my dad was soon after he got to Windermere. Pretty soon they took my dad, when he got a little bit better, they took him to a second sanatorium to recuperate. and that's him in the middle there. And then he went to oh, wait, just a picture popped in here. We mentioned that my dad had a shaved head, and a year later he looked a lot better. He had a full head of beautiful hair, and he looked healthy. He'd been able to eat. Then the third sanatorium that he went to is a place called Quairmead. Now, Quairmead has a very special role for my dad. First of all, he was there for several years. Second of all, can you see the lady to the far left there? She looks like she's got a nurse's outfit on. Yeah. So she was the head nurse. She left, and they said, we need a new head nurse. And so it just so happened that my mother had another sister named Eva, and Eva was a nurse, and Eva was hired to work here. She came to work here. And my mother came to visit her sister, and guess who she met? 74 years later. And I do want to say that my aunt, Eva, she came in 1949, so it's 4 years after the war ended. And so these cases that she dealt with were people who were still sick 4 years after the Holocaust was over. And she wrote a book about how do people who go through the Holocaust and then go through another very serious illness, how do they find a road back to life? So her book is called The Road Back. It's interesting if anyone wants to read it. So anyway, my dad met my mom, and that was very nice. So my dad, what do I want to say? Last year in Windermere, we went on a boat ride on Windermere, and those 6 of us there on the right, we realized that all our parents were in Quairmead together, and that was kind of a cool family history thing, because not many people have parents who not only survived the Holocaust, went to England with the Windermere children, and were in this sanatorium. But anyway, what do I want to say? So my dad was one of the boys, and the boys provided a lot of support for all the 732 children. And imagine, these are Holocaust survivors. They're traumatized, and they came over. Most of them lost most of their family. It's called the Jewish Refugees Committee. I'm going to call them the committee from now on because it's a long name. So the committee took each of those children and got them so they could be on their own. So a lot of them, if they weren't so sick, they gave them training. Maybe they become a car mechanic or an electrician, or some of them became jewelers or dentists or whatever they wanted to be. They helped them so that they could be independent. Some of them stayed just for a short while. In my dad's case, he was supported for 7 years, mainly because he was so sick for so long. So about a few years ago, I was able to get up 250 pages of social work notes on my dad, and my brother kindly put them in a book. So this is 7 years worth of letters back and forth about what they were thinking about with my dad. So just to give you an example of the kind of support that they gave him, which I learned mainly from this book, I'll run through a few examples. And imagine this was multiplied by 732 kids. It's just amazing what they did. So first of all, my father, I mentioned that his brother Charles had gone to Paris before the war. My father remembered the address, and he wrote to his brother, and they got reconnected. And then his sister, Hella, also survived separately from my dad. She also wrote to their brother, and so the 3 of them were connected. And that was like such a bracha that, he had a sister and a brother. Unfortunately, 1 brother was killed, but 3 out of the 4 of them survived. And then my uncle in Paris, Charles, he said that my dad had an uncle and aunt in Manchester, and he asked them to look for this uncle and aunt. It was my grandmother's sister. So they, in the notes, I see they kept looking. They wrote letters and they made phone calls, and it turned out my aunt and uncle his aunt and uncle had died, but the cousin survived. Unfortunately, she didn't want to have anything to do with my dad. My mom explains that times were different. Maybe everyone was kind of struggling after the war. They didn't have any extra money or extra coal or extra food. Maybe she just thought my dad wanted to schnorr. What he wanted was to be connected to his family because he's all alone there and very sick. But that didn't work out too well. But they put a lot of effort into it. I saw maybe like 10 letters and references to phone calls and stuff to try and connect with his family. A picture of my dad in the red circle. On the left is his brother, the woman is his sister, and then she married the other guy in the picture. This is a picture of the 3 united in Marseille, France, right before my aunt and uncle came to Palestine. they went to Palestine. So it was nice that they had each other. So other support that they had for my dad, they brought in a rabbi, maybe several rabbis, but one rabbi who happened to be my mother's family rabbi from London. He came to visit the boys, and the question was for each of the boys, what do you want to do? They were told they could stay in England for 2 years, but then what? What are they going to do with their life? So for my dad, some of the possibilities were where he could go to Palestine. A lot of the boys wanted to go to Palestine. He could go to Paris to be with his brother. He could be a foster child and go to the U.S. What did he want to do? He had no idea. So the rabbi got to know my dad, and he said, I think you should get an education. So that's the path my dad took. A little bit more on that later. They also found out that my dad loved to play violin. Before the war, he was apparently quite a good violinist. So they got him a violin, and they tried to make life more normal for these kids. There was someone who took them on field trips, took them to the movies, things like that. I sometimes wonder if my dad had survived and stayed in Theresienstadt, and no one was looking out for him, and he was sick for many years, what would have happened to him? These people took care of his medical care. They found the sanatorium for him. He had to go in the hospital a few times. They were in touch with my uncle about the medical issues. But what would have happened if he hadn't had all this support? I don't know. I really don't know. And then in terms of financial guidance, imagine these young people, when they were teenagers, if you were a normal American teenager, you'd be mowing the lawn or delivering the paper or having like some pocket money, and you learned to use money. They didn't learn any of that because they were trying to just survive from minute to minute. So I see through the letters that sometimes they gave my dad a little bit of financial guidance. One was to keep track of everything you spend, and he did that until he wasn't able to do that again. He was very good at tracking his expenditures. And then they helped him with his education. So the rabbi suggested, and my dad agreed, that he should get an education, but it wasn't so easy. First of all, he didn't know English. Second of all, he was very sick, so he started his education doing a correspondence course. He was literally in his sick bed and getting lessons, and then he'd mail it back and forth apparently. So somebody must have helped him. I don't know how he would have known how to do this correspondence course. Someone must have helped him do that. And then over the course of the next few years, my dad was zipping through all the education, but he was still pretty sick. And I don't understand tuberculosis so much, but apparently they might look okay, but they would get very, very tired. So there were a lot of concerns. My dad wanted to go out of where he was, out of Quermead. He said the school wasn't so good nearby, and they said, no, you're not ready, you're too weak, you can't go. But then eventually they let him go only during the week, and then he had to come back to Quermead on the weekends. So luckily my mom was there on a weekend, so he got to meet her then. But anyway, they really were concerned about that. Then in England, you can't just kind of pass because a teacher says, okay, enough, I'll let you pass. You have to pass very rigorous matriculation exams. And if you don't pass them, you can't go on to the next step. So my dad had, I think, 4 days of exams in London, and he had to go, he wasn't familiar with London. So one of the teachers went with him, and the head nurse went with him. And then after the exams were over, they took him to a concert, a Brahms violin concerto, which meant so much to him. That was always his favorite piece of music to listen because he was so grateful to be treated to this beautiful concert after such a stressful few days of exams. And my dad himself must have been very focused and very driven, and he talked about how he had so much trauma to deal with. You can imagine the trauma of what he'd been through, but yet he was focused, and he kept going. A few years ago, I met one of his friends who lived in Philadelphia, and he said he remembered my dad always was sitting there on a chair by the window, and it was always with a book he was studying. So anyway, this is a picture of my dad with a violin, and the man at the piano is one of the teachers. He was the one that took them on a lot of field trips. I see there's some maps of England on the left. I'm not sure what's on the right. But they did bring teachers in for them. This is another group at, I think at Quermead. You can see the head nurse in the back with the nursing thing, and next to her is one of the teachers. Anyway, what I want to say about this group is the boys, because they didn't really have much family, they became like brothers and sisters with each other. And we second generation feel like we're cousins. It's a very close relationship. So my dad ended up with not one but 2 bachelor's degrees. First he got a general science one, and then he went on to specialize in physics. And after that, he started to work. And while he was working, he went on to get a master's degree and a PhD. And I want to read you a little note my father wrote at the time when he finally got a job after 7 years of being supported. And he was so grateful to the committee. He wrote to them, "It is at times like these that one recalls the selfless love and devotion given to those in need by people like those who constitute this committee." So he wrote to them, and it always gives me, like, it's heartwarming to know how much they did for him. And then I have to say, I didn't quote it here, but when he got married to my mom, they got some money for gifts for their wedding, and my dad sent 10% of the gifts to this committee to sort of pass it forward to help other people. So in terms of his professional life, the rabbi can tell you more specifically what he did, but he was very much at the leading edge of engineering research. And he worked in England at a few jobs, and then in the US, the space race was going on, and they wanted to get a man on the moon. So Westinghouse wanted to hire someone with my dad's skills to work on the movie camera that took Neil Armstrong as he came down the ladder and landed on the moon. That movie camera was worked on by my dad. So that's how we came, my sister, brother, and I, we were all born in England, and then we came to the US when we were little, and my dad worked on that camera, and then he moved out to California, and he had an illustrious career. He retired around retirement age, and so he did many other things. I want to mention this book. I don't know if you could see it. It's called Small Steps. Someone just wrote a book about my dad in January. They were so impressed with what he was able to accomplish. So this book, it's written for young adults, and it's only 22 pages. It's a quick read, but it kind of flashes back between when our family is watching the moon landing, and we're about to see Neil Armstrong come on the moon, with flashbacks to his Holocaust experiences. And this book was sent to all the middle schools in England, and that was for Holocaust Memorial Week. So that's that. And the same author actually wrote a book about the Windermere children, if you've watched the movie. And he wrote a book, he kind of combined all the stories of the 300 children into, I think, 8 characters, but it was written about the Windermere children. Anyway, so back to my dad. So he met my mom, and immediately he felt part of her family. He had her parents became more like his parents, her siblings became like his, and he felt more normal. And then they got married, and my mom, I have to say, has a unique mixture of empathy for what my dad went through, and she's also very supportive, but she keeps the bar high. My dad couldn't get away with being lazy, or he had to jump high. She's also been the religious flame in the family. She's always the one that, she kept a very Jewish from home. And then they started a new family with the 3 of us as the products. My dad was always very involved in Jewish life in different ways. We lived in a little town in upstate New York for a while, and he became the president of B'nai B'rith there. And then we moved to California. He became the president of the shul. He was a gabbai. I know he was a gabbai here. I'm not sure if he was a gabbai in California, but he may have been. And until COVID started, he would come. Many of you have helped him out, coming here very early in the morning to learn, to daven. And unfortunately, he can't do that anymore. But this was actually a slide from the presentation my dad gave. People would ask him, what were your personal feelings during the war? And he said, hate is horrible. Hate is what got the Nazis to hate the Jews. And hate is what anti-Semitism is. And he didn't hate. He didn't emanate feelings of hatred. I would understand it if he did, but he didn't. He wanted to move on with life. And when he was asked, how did he survive, he thought about his family, and he didn't want to let the Nazis win. He wanted to, dafka, survive, do whatever it took to survive. So I think the ultimate triumph over adversity, which you might now understand why we use that tagline for him, is that we have a huge family. He's got over 40 great-grandchildren and more in the pipeline. So I just show you a little bit of an example of how big a family he has. They say if you save one life, it's as if you save a world, and this is what I feel when I see all these pictures. So this is just a sampling of our family, but that's my presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Singer and everyone for letting me talk. Thank you for your interest. And I have some of the books over there if you are interested. You're welcome to take them or look at them or whatever you like. That I said there were 3 cousins? Or the one that he escaped from Warsaw with?
Sam Novice.
Oh, okay. So there were 2 cousins he was with, Sam and Yisrael. Sam survived with my dad, and we knew him. He moved to Toronto, and we saw him often. His brother, one day, they were in Buchaval, he didn't feel well. He said, I'm not going to go to work today. They came back, and he was gone. Never to be seen again. So that was him. Unfortunately, and it was only a month before the end of the war, so it's a shame that he couldn't go further. Feel free to ask questions or comments. Our grandparents. So our grandparents, unfortunately, first our grandmother was taken away. We don't know the details. My aunts, my father's sister, she knew something and she didn't ever say. She was taken to Treblinka, and Treblinka was a killing camp. Auschwitz was partly an extermination camp and partly a work camp. Treblinka, you came in within an hour or 2, you were gone. So she went to Treblinka, and then my grandfather also went to Treblinka a few months later. I just came across a very heartbreaking postcard my grandfather wrote to a cousin who lived in Paris. And you remember my father's brother, Charles, was in Paris. My grandfather hadn't heard from Charles. We'll never know what happened to Charles during the war because he died in the 1970s. He didn't tell anyone. My cousins don't know what happened to their father. We don't seem to know either. So my grandfather wrote a postcard to his cousin in Paris, and he said, where is Charlie? Where is my son? Like, is he okay? And we have the actual postcard. But soon after that, our grandfather must have been taken away. My uncle possibly had to flee from Paris. So we don't really know what happened. He didn't have an easy time, but he wasn't in the concentration camp. And he did survive, came back to Paris, and got my dad's postcard. Oh, and they had a 4th sibling that I mentioned. His name was David. And as far as I can tell, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and they took a lot of the young men to a concentration camp that began with a P. Do you remember the name of it? I have it written down somewhere. And then he was exterminated. So he died. I think it's pretty amazing that my grandparents somehow got 3 of their 4 children out. And they survived. It wasn't easy. It was quite a miracle, but yeah. Yes. It's in the works. Yeah. So we talked about like a Windermere, how the first 300 went to Windermere, and this guy Trevor Avery discovered the story. I think it's been 18 years now. And he said, I think I was put on this earth to tell the story. So he's part of the reason why they made the movie and the documentary. And he developed a little museum, small museum and a library in Windermere, which tells the story of the Windermere children. And now Daniel Lipskin, he's the architect that built the Freedom Towers, where the World Trade Center is, where the Freedom Towers that replace that. He designed that. I was in Copenhagen a few months ago, and he designed the museum there, which tells the story of how the Jews were taken by boat to Sweden. He's designed the Berlin Holocaust Museum and a few others, and he's very good at, he incorporates the story into the museum. So he's designing it, and they're working on all the details of building a museum, except that the boys who were there, they said, don't call it a museum. We started to live when we were here, so you have to call it something else. It should show that this is their new life. They started to live when they came to Windermere, and I think you can understand a little bit more now how they started to live. Alida.
So you talked a lot about the 300, the first 300. What happened to the other 600?
Okay, so first of all, if you saw the movie, what you noticed in Windermere, they were only there at most 4 months because they were temporary barracks. So what the committee had determined, they had studied what happened with the kinder transport, which often didn't work well because they put people one-on-one in a home. Sometimes there was abuse, sometimes a Jewish kid was in a non-Jewish family. It didn't always work so well. So they said these people need to be in groups, like they said, a hostel with like 20 or 30 people. First of all, they'd gone through such horrors that we can never understand because we didn't go through them, so they were supportive to each other. Secondly, there was less likely to be abuse because there were 20 or 30 of them. And, if someone was abusing them, someone else could report it or something. So both the people that came from Windermere, they were farmed out to different hostels all around that went to London, Manchester, Liverpool, Scotland, a few other places like that. So that's what happened to them. But gradually, as they got on their feet, they might leave. A lot went to Israel, a lot went to the U.S., a lot went to live or work in England, or maybe they found a family member and went to live with them. So the other 432, there were 3 major batches of them. Some of them came to London and then went to Scotland, but they didn't like it. So they learned the lesson from that. They took the next batch straight to Scotland. But gradually they brought them back into, they mainly went to the big places in England, London, Gateshead, Manchester, Liverpool, whatever. I think there was a small group that was in Paris. I don't know much about that group. But so in London, a man named Ben Helfgott, you might have actually seen in the news, he just died. He was one of the boys. He and someone else organized a social club. Was it a house, Mom? Was it a house? So the boys would come. It's called
45A Society.
45A Society, right. So they incorporated as a group called the 45A Society, and they had a house which they would have social activities. You could come and play ping pong, you could play cards, you could schmooze, you could sit and read. They had, they brought in women to try to socialize with the men. So my dad knew most of the people. His friends were from the sanatorium, but the ones he knew from outside of that were because he went to the Primrose Club and he got to know them. So Ben Helfgott, who just died, he went to the Olympics for England. He was a champion weightlifter.
Team cap.
Team captain, thank you. Two different years, I think. And he won some of the Maccabi games also. So he taught our dad how to lift weights and a lot of the boys. So they started to become a whole, like a group, the boys. They're the boys. And they're very close with each other. Of course, they don't all know all 732. But every year they have a reunion. And they also got politically active and financially active. So when Palestine was, a group of them, some of them actually went into the army there, but some of them went to protest, we need a country. And then they raised money, and they raised money to help other people. They were helped, they wanted to pass it forward and help other people. So they helped children, they helped other people in need, and they continue to do that now. So what was I going to say? Yeah, so the other 432 probably didn't get the gold standard of treatment as the Windermere children did. I think that was probably the place they brought in the most help, but they did help them. So actually one hostel was for the young kids. Some were as young as 2. So there was someone who brought them up until they were able to be independent. Some of the young ones were adopted, and there was a famous story recently, you might have seen it, about a year ago. This man, his name is Jackie Young, he must be 82 now, but he was 2 when he came. He didn't know who he was. He was put up for adoption, and his adoptive parents didn't tell him he was adopted. When he went to get married, he needed his mother to take out of the bank safe deposit box his documents, and she was holding on to them. He had to show them so that they could prove he's Jewish and he could get married. So he grabbed the papers out of her hand, and he says, "Oh, I'm a Holocaust survivor. I came to register." But he was 2 years old. He didn't remember anything. But there was a woman who'd taken care of him for a few years. Her name was Alice. And have you seen that show where they bring in people from around the world to honor somebody? I think they did it with Harry Winton, who also helped a lot. So the same show, they honored Alice Goldberger. They brought in, she brought up all these kids. She brought them up. And so they brought her in to London, and it was a show. And so this guy, Jackie, he happened to be watching the show, and he realized, oh my God, I know Alice. I see her on the bus all the time. She always smiles at me, but I don't know who she is. And he started to realize, this is my life. I must have some connection here, because he just found out he's a Holocaust survivor. So he drove down to the TV studio, and he's banging on the door. "You've got to let me in. Let me in. It's my life." So he got in somehow, and then he connected. Alice had brought him up until he was adopted. And then, he did find out the name of his mother, but she didn't list the father, so he was dreadfully afraid that maybe his father was a Nazi. He didn't know how could he stay alive with a 2-year-old at Theresienstadt and his mother had died, and he didn't know how could he survive unless his father was a Nazi. So he lived with this fear all his life, and he was trying to find out who he was, but he didn't have much of anything to go on. So last year, these 2 women, they're DNA experts and genealogical experts, and they helped him. They took DNA sample, and they found out, in fact, his father was a Jewish man. He was killed in Theresienstadt. And he has some cousins. He now has cousins, like physical, cousins that are related to him. And so he's very grateful for that. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is each one had a different story. So Ben Helfgott became an Olympic champion, and then he went on to do a lot of Holocaust education, and he was knighted by the Queen. My dad went on to, as you heard, become a physicist, and some people became economists, some were business people. They did all sorts of things. They all had their differences.
Was that I saw the documentary, and Windermere, they took these kids. It was like the ideal environment for them to be rehabilitated out in the country, as much freedom as they could have. Really like state of the art, groundbreaking therapeutic techniques and art therapy. And it was just amazing that. I always wondered how your father was so, for all of the trauma that he went through, he's such a sweet, kind, well-adjusted person.
Right.
And I think Windermere probably had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, and past Windermere, because like I said, for 7 years he was supported. If anyone wants to take a look at this book, it's not really a book you read, but you can see all the notes here, just what they thought about. And they just wanted to make it good for everybody, and they kept track of it. And so I can imagine if they did this for everybody, it's just incredible what support these people who weren't even related to the boys. They just, an incredible support. And I keep thinking, I wish I could go back in time and thank them. Most of them are gone because my dad's 96 and they would have been even older than that. But some of them, the next generation is around, and I'd like to find a formal way to actually thank them.
Jews? Were they all Jews?
Well, so England let them in, but the fundraising had to be done, didn't come from England. So it was mainly Jews and actually a lot of Quakers. I don't know why the Quakers, but they did raise a lot of money. But I would say mainly what I read in here was mainly Jews. And if you watch the movie, there was Mr. Montefiore, and he was a very dynamic person. My mother, you could talk to her another time. She knew him personally. He did a lot for the boys. And actually, when my dad was getting more advanced in his studies, he wanted to go to college, and Mr. Montefiore would meet with my dad, and then he'd dip into his pocket and provide the money, pay the tuition. The tuition was like 40 pounds, and not like we have now, but it was probably equivalent at the time. And then there was Oscar Friedman, who you saw in the movie. He was the psychologist. There are a lot of letters back and forth between Oscar Friedman and my dad. He seemed to be kind of the accountant. He'd dole out the money, he'd arrange things and things like that. So he was very involved in my dad's life. Of course, my mother coming into the picture, I'm sure, was an incredible support for my dad. And all the support he got, he had the rabbi who would come in. And then also a group of students was going to Cambridge College, and they would bike in. It would be 30 miles for them each way. They'd bike in and visit the boys who were sick in Quermead. And my dad, one of them, two of them, I think they were married to each other. My dad had to do a chemistry lab one summer, and they arranged for my dad to do the lab work and to stay somewhere in Cambridge for a summer. And then another one became a very famous, some kind of scientist at MIT. And I met him because he lived near where I was living in Newton. So anyway, he got just so much support in many, many ways. And so he was a very lucky guy, and he became part of my mom's family. My grandfather, my mother's father, helped him file for compensation, so he got money from the Germans pretty early on. And he wrote an article that actually is it in the second version? He wrote an article where he talks about how grateful he was to be part of the boys, to be part of my mom's family, and just he thought he was so abnormal because, not him personally, but his life was so abnormal, perhaps it would never be a normal life. But then he saw his sister and brother got married, and they started to have kids, and he met my mom, and he thought maybe there was a future possible for him. And we see he did have a very nice future. I mean, the beginning was really bad, but I really like the tagline of the boys, triumph over adversity. And I think it motivates me, and I think probably a lot of people, that you can have a very hard time in life, and you can make something of yourself. And but you can't do it alone. So
Leah and Hara, how many great-grandchildren do your parents have, roughly speaking?
40 or more.
40.
And there are a few in the pipeline.
Yeah.
Stay tuned, next year will probably be 50. But he was fruitful and multiplying. A lot of help from the...
Supportive children, too.
Yeah. So, any...
I was doing a little more reading about, so one, there was a similar program in France that Elie Wiesel went to. Similar situation, boys stealing food and then stuff like that, and holding food. It really speaks to the brilliance of the team that took care of that. One article I read today, one little vignette, was that, that first scene where they all take all this food, it did keep going on because they quickly understood. They said, we took all the kids into the kitchen and said, there's more, we get bread every day. You don't have to hoard. And it extinguished the negative behavior very quickly, gave them confidence very, very quickly. The other thing I read was seeing with the bicycles, the people in the village left their house like unlocked and nothing stored, and so the kids would take the bikes, the boys would take the bikes. But this one boy said, he always returned them, so they were good, they had good neshamas, they knew it didn't really belong to them, but they always returned it. I'm sure that they learned also not to do how to ask them eventually, but it was really a brilliant set of adults. Tremendous compassion.
Anna Freud was in,
The daughter.
Oh, right, yes. Anna Freud was there, and she studied the children, and actually a lot of her theories were based on the work with the Windermere children. And also, what's her name? Marie Prenef was the art therapist. I actually had a friend who was an art therapist, and she studied Marie Prenef's work. You remember the picture of my dad in the bed? That was Marie Prenef. Yeah, and I think that they had learned so much from the experience of the Kindertransport kids, and then they brought it to these children to make things better. The one thing I noticed quite often is the children who were adopted, put up for adoption, I guess at the time, they didn't share with their children that they're adopted. So I know another woman, I have a friend, I was kind of a small one, so I have a friend who's married to a woman, and years ago we said, oh, my father's a Holocaust survivor. He said, my sister-in-law is a Holocaust survivor. And that was about it. And then when the Windermere Children movie came out, I was putting on Facebook, stuff about my dad, and he said, oh, my sister-in-law was a Windermere child, and we were figuring out, how did this happen? So my friend Svi's in-laws adopted this young Holocaust, Windermere child named Judi. She was a little girl. They adopted her, and they never told her she was adopted, and then they had their own birth children, and they didn't tell them that their older sister was adopted. And it wasn't until my friend's wife was in her 20s that she found out that her sister was a Holocaust survivor and one of the Windermere children. So that was kind of an interesting connection.
I think that was common in society in general.
It could be.
In the 40s that you hush-hushed origins, there's closed adoption, there's no such thing as open adoption.
Yeah. It could be. It seemed to me it was very traumatic for a lot of people.
It was traumatic also for everybody. So. His parents also moved out from England and did the war in England themselves.
Right. It wasn't easy. It wasn't an easy time. We don't want to make judgments, but it was.
But they did what they thought they were supposed to do.
One more thing I just want to mention. My dad would never give us many details about the Holocaust, but he always said, read Night by Elie Wiesel. He said Elie Wiesel was on the same death march as him. Elie Wiesel started in Hungary, where the war didn't really start until 1944, but after 1944, he was on more or less the same path as my dad. And my dad said, I'm not going to write any better than Elie Wiesel. Read Night, and I want to vouch that everything that happened in that book happened to me. I witnessed all those things. So if you...
I remember one conversation I had with your father. It still strikes me. I can't forget it. So most of us have probably seen Schindler's List. And there was one scene in Schindler's List where Nazi went over to someone working in the factory with a stopwatch and said, okay, I want to see you go ahead and put this piece together. And he went ahead and he worked very hard and put the piece together in time, and he said, oh, that's fantastic, except that you've been working here for 2 hours and you just put this piece together in about 5 minutes. You should have 50 more pieces in there. You've been slacking off. And he took the guy outside as part of the movie and made him get on his hands and knees and get on his knees and started shooting at him, but the gun misfired. And I asked your father if he saw Schindler's List, and he said he did. And I asked him if he remembered the scene. He said he did. He said it's realistic except for one thing: the guns didn't misfire. That's what your father.
Yeah, right, yeah. He always said that Hollywood could never make it as bad as it was because we couldn't bear to watch it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing that he did.
Yeah.
Very special person. The face of Amala. Anybody can go and visit him and sing to him.
So if your father had gone through a lot about his experiences,
No.
how did you guys piece it together?
Oh, okay, so 2 things
There's so
happened.
many details.
Yeah, first of all, he didn't talk to us when we were young. A few times I remember sitting down with him and saying, Dad, you have to tell us what happened to you. And he did a little bit, but not much. He tried to move on to some other conversations. But then in 1995, the 50th year reunion of the boys, Martin Gilbert put that book together. He hadn't put the book together yet. We came to the reunion of the boys, and my parents used to go for the big ones, like 40th, 50th, whatever. So the 50th reunion, Martin Gilbert was there, and he said, if you guys write your story down and send it to me, I'll write a book about you. So my dad sat next to my mom, and he told her what to write. And my mom will tell you it was very, very difficult for my dad, and I think your wife, actually, his wife, encouraged my dad to tell the story. She said, you've got to tell the story for your children and your grandchildren and people that are denying the Holocaust. You've got to tell it. So he very painfully got a version of the story that my mother typed up, and they sent it in to Martin, and he wove in my dad's story into that book. And we took the, I think Martin...
The video also. He has the video
Oh,
with
right.
Spielberg and stuff.
Right, that's right, yes. Thank you. So my dad was videotaped twice, first by an organization in San Francisco, and then by the Spielberg Association. They interviewed him. Again, he never got into the gory details. My dad went to the war with a cousin that I mentioned, Sam Novice, and he also was reported, and I watched his testimony, so he told more of the gory details of what actually happened. Then a lot of it is, well, I got that book that I mean, the social work notes, and in terms of, in the middle of the Holocaust, I've done some research. I went to Yad Vashem and I researched. There was a book that showed every day in Auschwitz exactly where the transport came in or went out to. So I could see on August 4th, that was the day they brought 1,400 people from this factory. That's how I know when they came. And then I actually wrote away, there's a place called the Harrelson Archives. It's got, like, the Germans are releasing millions of documents. So they keep digitizing them. They're not all digitized. But you can do either a top-level search. So I typed in my dad's name, got a lot of documents that are available online, and then you can do a custom search. So they sent me 60 many pages from Buchenwald. In Buchenwald, they were so obsessive, so they wrote everything down. They wrote my dad and his number from Warsaw, from Auschwitz. Then they gave him a new name, so the 3007, again, consecutive Buchenwald numbers that are different from the Auschwitz numbers. And then they just became a number. So I have a list, pages and pages. As someone from the Harrelson Archives gratefully wrote on the bottom what the list was. The one list was these people, this list of numbers, 100 numbers on the page, were okay to work. These ones were going to be moved from this barrack to this barrack. These were moving from Buchenwald to the subcamp. So we actually have records of where my dad went from Buchenwald. I don't have the equivalent from Auschwitz, but they do. I do know when he arrived in Buchenwald, and apparently, like, there are atlases where they show you this date, this transport came from Auschwitz and went here, and this group went there, and so I can look up the date. You can say some historians have figured it out. So you can kind of put pieces together. I've been kind of studying it for maybe 10 years in an learning more. I learned a lot at Windermere because this guy Trevor is doing a lot of film research, so I learned a lot about post-war things. And I was just in England again this past May, and I went to a place where some of the other boys went. My dad was not this place, but it was in a place called Southampton. And it was a beautiful, again, a country estate. We got to go out there. And the guy who owns it now, he's a country gentleman. He doesn't live there. He comes to visit, but it's gorgeous, beautiful to check it out. He lives somewhere else. But he was contacted a few years ago, and he was told, the boys came and lived here after the war. He was so excited, so he was happy to have a whole group of us, the three of us went. And he was so happy not only to show us his beautiful house, but he wanted to know the history of his house. So this house has been owned by a brother of Montefiore, who was luckily destroyed, and then he sold it. Montefiore sold it to the grandfather of the guy who died. But it was just a beautiful place, and my dad led, a beautiful life, although he had a lot of sorrow. So I think that's it for now. I'm happy to talk more about any of this, and you're welcome to.
Definitely you take a magazine. It's not like this. I'll set it up as there are CDs for sale and audio if you'd rather listen to it at home. The Sam Heritage Foundation presentation, we can do that.